Sorry, it always feels like afternoon. How are you guys doing today? All right, great. Hey, so I hope you're ready to hear a very inspiring speaker, Mr. Salinger, who's a Holocaust survivor. You guys, since probably elementary school, have been learning about Holocaust, and to have somebody here to speak to you about firsthand what it was like, I think is pretty incredible. I know that Ms. Huddleston has questions, but there'll be time at the end for you guys to ask questions and things like that. While he's speaking, and while you're here, I just would like, pardon me, to remind you of our 3 expectations, right? Be kind, be respectful, show integrity. So if you have earbuds, take them out, give Mr. Salinger your full attention. With that, I'm going to turn it over to him. Hope you guys enjoy his speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Good morning, everybody. I see a lot of bright, smiling faces. Glad to see you here. Thanks for taking the time to be here. So, okay, let's start at the beginning. So my name is Werner, W-E-R-N-E-R. That's a German name because I was born in Berlin, Germany. My last name is Salinger, like the author J.D. Salinger. I'm not J.D., but I am an author. And I was born on April 5th, 1932. And 10 months after I was born in Germany, on the 30th of January, 1933, anybody know what happened? Say again? Well, it was sort of the beginning of the Holocaust, but I'm referring to the appointment of Adolf Hitler as Chancellor in Germany. Chancellor is sort of like a prime minister in a country like England, for instance. So he was appointed. He was never elected. And he was appointed on the 30th of January. I was still just 6 years old. And I, of course, had no idea about what was about to happen. But what was about to happen was the beginning of the Holocaust. He had made no secret of it. He had written a book called Mein Kampf, which means, the translation means My Battle. And he had written that while he was in jail in Landsberg in Germany. And he was released from jail and began to get involved in the politics and began to get involved in Nazi politics, which led to the Holocaust. So my story kind of progresses through the early years of the Nazi years. I had no idea about what was happening. But one of the things that the Nazis wanted to do immediately, before they started arresting people and killing people, they really wanted to pass some laws that would begin to discriminate against their major minority population, which were the Jews. Now, Jews have been around since before the birth of Jesus. As you probably know, Jesus was Jewish and led to a great religion called Christianity. But Jews have been around for a very long time, and they have almost always experienced discrimination against them. So my next memory of the Holocaust is probably my most vivid memory of the Holocaust, which occurred on the night of November 8th to November 9th in the year 1938. Anybody know what that might have been? Well, it's known as Kristallnacht in Germany, or Crystal Night. And it was a very vivid demonstration of the very overt discrimination against the Jews in Germany. And it led to the killing of hundreds of people on that night, and to the breaking of glass of any business, any storefront that was owned by Jews, and the burning of synagogues. Now, synagogues, of course, are the houses of worship for people of the Jewish faith. Jewish faith is kind of different from other faiths in that it's more than a faith, it's also an ethnicity. It's kind of a cultural thing, more so than other religions maybe. But anyway, I remember Kristallnacht. We lived on the second floor, right in the heart of Berlin, in the very center of Berlin. which today is a very beautiful city, by the way, and was in the 1930s too, and then suffered a lot of destruction in the Second World War through Allied bombing raids and so on. So I lived in the middle of the city, and we lived on the second floor of this apartment. I was able to look down as a 6-year-old kid at all the broken glass on the street just outside the building in which we lived. But more than the broken glass, I also could smell the smoke. Very acrid, very vivid memory of smelling the smoke of the burning synagogue, which was just about a block away. And fire departments all over Germany were under orders not to put those fires out, to just let those synagogues burn. There was one synagogue actually in Berlin and another part of Berlin that had a very courageous fire captain who refused to follow those orders and refused to let the building burn, and he just turned out to be a hero of the Holocaust, and it has been so recognized. So how did I get to America? Well, let's talk about the Nuremberg Laws first. The Nuremberg, and that's one of the things I really want you guys to remember today. If you don't remember anything else, remember that things like the Holocaust almost always start with some political pressure, and if you don't stand up, we call them upstanders here today. I belong to the Arizona Jewish Historical Society. There are about 70 Holocaust survivors currently in the state of Arizona. And Arizona, by the way, is one of the few states in the United States that has mandated the teaching of the Holocaust, and you're part of that now because you're studying it. You have to be taught as a school child in Arizona. You have to be taught twice between the grades of grade 7 and grade 12 to learn about the Holocaust. And not just the Holocaust as it affected Jews, but other genocides that have killed hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. The one that most frequently comes to my mind is the Rwanda genocide in 1994. So in order to come to the United States, you have to have a sponsor. And that's a very legitimate thing. I think most other countries around the world have that as well, because no government wants immigrants to become a liability to the taxpayer of the state that us folks are moving to. And you had to have a sponsor to come to the United States. My mom and dad, I was an only kid, so we arrived in this country on on February 12th. Yeah, I just had an anniversary, February 12th, 1939. I was 2 months shy of my 7th birthday, but I wouldn't be here today if it hadn't been for a man named Carl Laemmle. Carl Laemmle was the founder of Universal Studios. He was a German Jew, I believe, emigrated here in the 1800s as a very young 17-year-old kid, became very successful, and founded, among other things, made hundreds of movies, and founded Universal Studios. And he was from a city called Laupheim in Germany. Laupheim is sort of in the central part of Germany. And because he had become quite wealthy when the Holocaust began, he decided he was going to try to help Jewish families who were trying to emigrate from Germany, who had members who had come from his hometown, Laupheim. My mother happened to be one of 5 sisters, and her oldest sister was married to a man from Laupheim, Germany. And so Carl Laemmle sponsored their emigration to the United States. And I guess my parents, in trying to find a sponsor, kind of ran out of possibilities. And then someone told them about Carl, I guess maybe the older sister of my mother, told them about Carl Laemmle, and so they approached him. And he first said, no, you know what, I've done this dozens of times, I just can't do it again. I had an uncle who by that time already lived in the United States. He said, I got to go see this man. I've got to try to convince him to do it one more time for Kurt and Hilda Salinger and their little boy, Werner. That was me. And so my uncle was successful, and Karl Lemmel said, okay. And if he hadn't said that, I probably wouldn't be sitting here today talking to you. But he did, and I'm here. I want to talk briefly again about the laws. They're called the Nuremberg Laws. They were passed in 1935. Remember, Nazis came to power in 1933 when Hitler was appointed, not elected, appointed chancellor. So between 1933 and 1935, they were very actively working on drafting these laws, passing them in the German parliament so that they would become laws. And they were laws that discriminated against the Jewish population of Germany. But they didn't just go into thin air and find the course of how those laws should be written. They decided, right after Hitler's appointment in 1933, to send a team of lawyers, all of whom were members of the Nazi Party, to the United States of America. This is now 1933, 34, to study the racial discriminatory laws in the United States of America. In the mid-1930s, the Nazis thought, probably correctly so, that the United States of America already had laws, for instance, Jim Crow laws. There were a lot of discriminatory laws against Asian Americans, especially Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos, people like that. And those laws were, the anti-Asian laws prohibited any person of Asian descent, especially people coming from China, Japan, the Philippines, from ever becoming citizens of the United States. And then, of course, I'm sure that most of you have learned about the Jim Crow laws that were so powerful up until the Civil Rights Movement in this country in the 60s and 70s. So the Nazis sent lawyers over here to study our laws so they could write their laws that would be even better and maybe even harsher than the laws in this country. But the laws that they wrote became known as the Nuremberg Laws, and they were publicized in September 1935. I'll just talk briefly and give you the titles of two of the laws, the Nuremberg Laws. By the way, Nuremberg is a beautiful city in Germany, and I think some of you are studying or have studied World War II history, you might be familiar with the Nuremberg trials that were held in what was a building called the Palace of Justice in the city of Nuremberg. And I actually worked there when I was in the Air Force in Germany. I'll tell you that story in a minute. And worked in that same building, not at the time of the trials, but just a few months after. So these were two of the Nuremberg Laws. The first one is called the Reich Citizenship Law, which defined who could be a legal citizen of Germany. In other words, they wanted to exclude Jews. You had to have what they called Aryan blood, pure German blood. I don't know, I think maybe referring to today's times, in this country we see some quite a bit of racial strife still going on. And you might say if we had written a law in this country that you couldn't be a citizen unless you had white blood. I mean, that never happened, but that's maybe a possibility. Not anymore, thankfully, but it used to be. And that was the first of the Nuremberg Laws. It defined who could legally become a citizen of Germany, and it excluded anyone that was deemed to be Jewish. And the second law is the law of the protection of German blood and honor, which began by prohibiting interracial marriage and then went on to ban other interactions between German Jews and non-Jews. That's the law that really affected me as a young kid. I remember going to kindergarten in Germany, mixed. There were Jews, there were non-Jews, totally mixed before this law became law in Germany in September 1935. And then all of a sudden I couldn't go anymore to the kindergarten than I had been going to. Because I was a Jew, I could only go to school or to kindergarten or preschool with kids who were Jewish. I could not mix socially or educationally with anyone who was considered to be of Aryan or pure German blood. So those were the two major discriminatory laws, and they had studied on how to write those laws by coming to the United States of America in the mid-1930s to see how Americans treated their racial minorities. I just recently learned that. I found that to be really incredible to learn that about this country. But you can look it up, you can Google it, and that is exactly what happened. And then after the laws were passed, they continued to send people to this country to study what Americans were doing to their minorities. So, an interesting twist to my story. I got here, as I said, February 1938. Grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, went to high school there, started going to school at the college at the University of Maryland, and then the Korean War broke out. I don't know if you've ever studied or learned about the Korean War, but it was in the 1950s. And I was determined to join the military, and I did. And I joined the U.S. Air Force. Highly recommended to anyone who might be thinking of a military career. Spent 7 years in the U.S. Air Force, almost 4 of them in Germany in the 1950s, 51, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 55. Of course, you don't recall that period unless you studied it, but that was, we were right in the middle of the Cold War. As a matter of fact, that was the very height of the Cold War. And Winston Churchill had come and given a speech in Fulton, Missouri in 1946. And in that speech, he first defined what he called the Iron Curtain that had fallen, separating Eastern Europe from Western Europe. So I went to Germany. I'm a fluent German speaker because my father insisted that I speak German as I was growing up as a kid, which was really great because it affected my Air Force career. Ended up in Air Force intelligence, spent a lot of time in the early 50s trying to gain intelligence on what was then known as the Soviet Union, today known, of course, as Russia. And at that time, 51, 2, 3, we were convinced, the Western world was convinced that we would be fighting a war with the Soviet Union in a minute. So I got sent to the Iron Curtain, just a mile or two from the Iron Curtain, and we interviewed German POWs. The International Red Cross had discovered that the Soviets were still holding about 10,000 maybe German prisoners of war, and they raised quite a stink about it. The Soviets said, okay, I guess it's time to send these guys home. So they did. Well, these guys had all been involved in the rebuilding of the Soviet Union, so they knew a lot about the Soviet Union. They knew how long the runways were in the new airfields, and what kind of steel was used in the new bridges, and how thick the factory walls were in the new factories. And we were interested in gaining that information so that we could destroy it again, so that we could create the proper bombing folders so we could destroy it again in the next war, which we were all convinced would happen any minute, but fortunately never did. In the process of being in Germany, and this is the interesting part of my story, I think, as it relates to the Holocaust, I met a young German woman. I first thought, well, hey, nice to have a friend, a German female friend that I can travel around Europe with. But as frequently happens in situations like that, we fell in love. And then we got married. And my wife, who is still alive, tomorrow is her 89th birthday, actually. She was a daughter of a Nazi army soldier. So here's this Jewish refugee kid back in Germany, falling in love with a German daughter of a Nazi soldier. It's worked out pretty well. We've been married about 70 years. That's okay. So that's kind of my story. Remember the Nuremberg Laws, please? September 1935. Two highly discriminatory laws that affected the Jews, and really, in Germany at that time, was kind of the beginning of the Holocaust. Did not immediately lead to killings, arrests and killings. That really started in 41, 42. I happen to have grandparents, they were actually my stepmother's grandparents, who actually were, my grandfather was both in Dachau and in Theresienstadt, which was one of the camps, but they survived the war. Actually, they were released in February 1945. The International Red Cross again became influential in my life. They had arranged an exchange, 75 prisoners from Theresienstadt, German Jewish prisoners, for 75 seriously wounded German soldiers. And my grandparents were released in February 45, were sent to Montreux in Switzerland, and spent a year there getting their paperwork in order to come to this country. And of course their sponsors were my family. And so they came and lived with us from 46 till they died. My grandfather, I never had any real grandfathers. They all died, both of them died before I was born. But this man, very quiet, mellow man who had survived the camps, lived with us and almost reached his 101st birthday. So that's kind of my story, and I'm sticking to it, and maybe we can have some questions. Ms. Allenstein's going to come up. If you have a question, you may want to raise your hand.
Were you homeschooled?
Was I homeschooled? No. I went to Baltimore Polytechnic Institute for high school and the University of Maryland for college, partly. And then I went into the Air Force for 7 years. And when I came out, I went to school at Goddard College, which is up in Vermont. So no, I was not homeschooled. I understand today. I've got 6 grandkids and 5 great-grandkids, so I'm kind of aware of what's going on in schools today. I understand a lot of people today are. And if the parents do a good job, which I'm sure all of your parents do, then that's a wonderful thing. Except for the school board member sitting here, who wishes more, like I do, that more people would go to public school. Ms. Hamilton, you have some questions?
So one of my classes had asked, what is your relationship with your father-in-law, considering...
Oh, that's a great question. I had a wonderful relationship. I have to explain this to you. Yes, he was a member of the Nazi Party, but he was what we would call in this country a bureaucrat. And he worked for the German version of the IRS, the tax people. He was an auditor, a tax auditor. And he did that all his life, and then of course things got really hectic in the late 1930s. And he was told one day, somebody noticed that he was not a member of the Nazi Party, and he was given a choice. Keep your job and become a member of the party. Don't become a member of the party and lose your job. He had 3 kids at the time, 2 more after the war, but 3 kids at the time, and he did what a lot of people do when they are faced with that decision. He joined the party. So technically, yes, he was a member of the Nazi Party, but both he and his wife were very liberal people. They loved me and I loved them. They were wonderful people.
Do you guys have any questions before I go on? Pink shirt?
How does the events that happened affect your brother or mother?
How do you going through these events affect your current outlook on modern life?
Great question. When you go through an event when you are part of Crystal Night and you watch and you recognize, and then you have people in your own family who've been in the camps and so on. I can't obviously speak for other people, but to answer your question, I think it made me much more aware of what can happen in politics and how it can so easily drift away and become autocratic and undemocratic. I mean, one of the great things about this country, and you know, somebody asked me at a school I was in recently what I like best about the United States, and my immediate response is freedom. And I know we're not the only country that has freedom, but we have an experiment here that has worked out for over 200 years. And one of the great things about this country is the opportunity that people have to do things in their life pretty much without limitations, doing what they feel like doing. So I think it affected my life to be much more aware politically of what's going on in the country. And remember the Nuremberg Laws. I mean, they can happen anywhere. They can happen anywhere. People, democratically. I mean, we can have laws. We did historically in this country have many laws. Well, you can begin with slavery and go forward from there. We have many laws that we would never, ever consider today. And eventually people rose up and fought them and created a freer and better country. But I think it makes you much more aware. I also happen to be very passionate about international affairs. I belong to the Phoenix Committee on Foreign Relations. I belong to the Boston Committee on Foreign Relations, and I'm deeply immersed in world affairs. I just finished 14 years, by the way, of lecturing on cruise ships on world affairs. It was a wonderful gig, and then COVID came along, and that was the end of that. But I think in answer to the question, it made me much more aware of what's going on in the world.
How much family do you have left, with considering everything with the holocaust?
Well, I never had any siblings. How much family do I have left? Both my parents are long gone. I'm an old guy. I'm going to be 90 in about 5 weeks. So I'm an old guy. But my wife, Martha, who I told you was the daughter of a Nazi soldier, and her birthday is tomorrow. She's going to be 89. So we had 6 kids, and they in turn, no, sorry, we had 4 kids. They in turn gave us 6 grandkids, and some of those grandkids are now giving us great-grandkids. So we have 6 grandkids and 5 great-grandkids, and all of that came because I fell in love with a German girl who was the daughter of a Nazi soldier.
Yep. Go ahead, Vinny. Your hat. You. Red hat? What's your favorite World War II or Holocaust-related book?
World War II or Holocaust-related what?
Book?
Oh, book. Yeah, that's a good question. I've not read the book called Maus, M-A-U-S, which has just been taken off the bookshelves of some school systems in this country. I've not yet read it, but I'm about to. And I understand it is the best Holocaust book ever written, supposedly. So that's certainly one. I've read a lot of books. There's a book out called Aftermath, which I'm about to read also, which is about the time in Germany right after the Second World War, which is really the time that I was over there when I was in the Air Force in the early 50s. When I arrived back in Germany on December 16th, 1951, and we had crossed the Atlantic on a troop ship and landed in Bremerhaven, Germany, And then we boarded a train for a 2-day ride to southern Germany, where we all had to go to be assigned to wherever we were going to be stationed. And this was December 1951, and of course, being on a train, we always went through the center of many cities, and Germany was still a disaster. I mean, it was totally bombed out, and every time we had to stop in an area of a train station, the train would be deluged by people, mostly men, walking, many of them on crutches, having lost a leg in the war, begging for handouts of money or cigarettes or whatever. It was really still a disaster. And then when I left about 5 years later, the Germans do what Germans really do well. They put their shoulders to the wheel and rebuilt the country. So after the 2 books I'd recommend if you're interested in reading about the Holocaust. One is Maus, M-A-U-S, which is the German word for mouse. In this country, M-O-U-S-E, but in German, M-A-U-S. And a book called Aftermath.
Did you have any Jewish friends in Germany, or do you still have Jewish friends here in the United States?
Oh, did I have Jewish friends in Germany? Well, my best Jewish friends in Germany, the kids I played with when I was 5 and 6 years old, did not survive the Holocaust. Their father was a doctor who did survive the Holocaust, but the mother and the 2 kids did not. So I no longer had them because they were killed. I did have a cousin in Germany who was the daughter of one of my mother's 5 sisters. And she had married a German Catholic man who was a dentist in a small town called Wangen in Germany. And she had converted to Catholicism. And this is kind of an interesting story. One day during the war, Wangen was a relatively small town down in the southern part of Germany. In World War II days, it might have had a population of 10 or 12,000 people. One day the mayor and my uncle, Albert, married to my aunt Lucy, who was one of my mother's sisters, was a dentist also, as my mother was. And one day the mayor of Wangen got an order from somewhere ordering anyone married to a Jewish person to bring that spouse to City Hall. So Uncle Albert is a pretty feisty guy, long now dead, but he gathered the other, I think they were all men married to Jewish wives. And there were 6 or 7 of them. He gathered all 6 or 7 of them, marched down to the mayor's office, and kind of said, "We're not going to do this. We're not going to turn our wives in. You can forget about the order." He probably used more descriptive words, but I won't do that here on stage this morning. And the result of that was that my cousin Traudl and her mother, my aunt Lucy, had, from that point on, which was probably halfway through the Second World War, could no longer leave the house. She could no longer go to school. So they kind of stayed in that apartment till the war ended in May 1945. So that's my only, to my knowledge, my only Jewish relative that I had who had really become Catholics, and my playmates who were killed in the Holocaust. Oh, but in this country, yeah, especially here in Phoenix. Phoenix has something called the Arizona Jewish Historical Society, which I am now a member of, a great organization. And also in Phoenix, there's a group called the Phoenix Holocaust Association, of which I'm now a board member. So yeah, I have a lot of Jewish contacts here.
What? Yep. Do you think it would be possible for another genocide like the Holocaust to happen, or do you think we've moved past that?
I wish I could say I thought we'd moved past that, but I really cannot say that. We've seen other Holocausts. As a matter of fact, at the Arizona Jewish Historical Society, every month we have a talk by a Holocaust or a genocide survivor So we do talk about other genocides, and we have had other genocides. I think the most notable one is Rwanda in 1994. I used to think it was not possible in this country. I had a lot of arguments about it with people. I said, no, that could never happen in the United States. I still think it couldn't happen in the United States, but I don't think about that as confidently as I used to.
Richard? When did you notice that the events of the Holocaust were going down, or were you aware of what was going on?
Well, the Holocaust ended on May 8th, 1945, when the Allied troops in Europe were victorious and all of the camps were liberated. One of the things the Nazis did towards the very end of the war, and I've seen memorials of it. One of the things that Germany has done, by the way, I think very dramatically, is memorize the Holocaust. There are a lot of memorials in many German cities. But I'm thinking now about the death marches that occurred just in the last few months of the Holocaust, when the Nazis were trying to empty the camps. I don't know what they were trying to do. I have written some poetry about it because I've seen memorials about those death marches that occurred in March and April of 1945, and a lot of people still perished. If you could, I mean, they walked hundreds of miles. They were forced to walk hundreds of miles. But the Holocaust effectively ended when the Allied armies were victorious on May 8th, 1945.
All right, guys, we're ending towards the in a fourth hour right now, but please give a warm and awesome round of applause for Mr. Salinger. And thank you so much.